You're watching Breakthrough News.
I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and you're watching Breakthrough News on BTR today. Today we're talking about the current escalation of violence in Gaza. Joining me to discuss this is John Neffel of Radio Dispatch. John, thank you for joining me. I think we can both agree that this is both a humanitarian and a political crisis. The death toll is now, as of now, over 650 for the Palestinians, and for Israel it's 35. Did it have to get to this point?
Well, I think that's a really interesting and important question. And in terms of if it had to get to this point, it's a question of who wanted it to get to this point. And unfortunately, it can be good politics, domestic politics within Israel, to show how tough you are on Palestinians. And so there are really, I think, perverse incentives within Israel to escalate the latest round of violence. And there is also a tendency within Hamas to stay with an armed resistance and to stay with that ideology. And so I think that said, that to the extent that it did have to get to this level, it's much more Israel's doing than Hamas is doing, and part of that is because Israel refuses to stop illegal settlements and refuses to lift the blockade on Gaza, which is in itself an act of war. And it makes armed resistance really inevitable when you have essentially the world's largest open air prison living in a place where there's no economy and no movement available.
So Israel can easily say, look, we actually tried to have a ceasefire, which Hamas rejected twice, over the last few days. But you're saying, it sounds like you're very sympathetic with Hamas's sort of desperate lobbying of rockets as a statement. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that I would say that it's a statement, but I would say that it's a form of resistance.
But if it's not, if it's not a statement, then it's an active attempt to, kill Israelis and destroy Israeli infrastructure. If it's more than a statement.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly violence. There's no question about that, and it's certainly an armed struggle. But to the first part of your question, I mean, Hamas has given its conditions for a ceasefire prior to the widely reported ceasefire that I think somewhat misleadingly they are reported to have refused. That ceasefire was brokered in secret between Egypt and Israel, and it was a really one-sided thing that I think was largely a pretext to set the stage for a ground invasion, which it did. And Hamas's conditions for a ceasefire, by their very nature, necessitate lifting the blockade of Gaza, and that's something that Israel doesn't want to do. And any government, which Hamas is the democratically elected government, whether people in the West like that or not, and any government who finds itself under a blockade would demand the exact same conditions for a ceasefire. And so I think that it's really important to always position the occupation and the blockade at the nexus of this and as the real origin of the conflict.
So you definitely think that the conditions of the ceasefire, which Hamas has stated and which Abbas now supports, you definitely think that they're completely reasonable?
I mean,
I could
they're
see
they're
over
they're
the long term, of
understandable.
course,
Yeah, I
that's what
mean,
they would want. But I could see how, in the immediate short term, to me, it seems slightly unreasonable to be demanding those things up front with no room for negotiation when we're in the middle of such a messy crisis, you know?
yeah. I mean, I see what you're saying, but I think that that's the nature of negotiations is that you perhaps ask for more than you think you can get up front. And I mean, if you're Hamas and you look at the last several times this has happened, whether it was the 2008 siege bombing and invasion, or the bombing campaign in 2012 that Israel carried out. If you're Hamas, you're going to say, unless there are actual changes made, this is just going to keep repeating itself, and so we're gonna ask for these huge changes. And I think that it's important to remember that I just saw these statistics before we started, so I haven't independently fact checked them. But it's something like 90% of the casualties on the Israeli side have been uniformed soldiers, and something like between 70 and 80% of the casualties on the Palestinian side have been civilians. Israel is, I believe, the world's fourth largest army. They receive a quarter of their military aid from the U.S. They're a nuclear power, and so it's important to recognize that they are by far the superior military power here, and that is largely made possible because of U.S. patronage.
I mean, I'm clearly playing devil's advocate here,
Mm-hmm.
but of course, it's it's difficult to avoid civilian casualties if, as Israel claims, Hamas is deliberately using human shields. Do you think that those claims are exaggerated?
Yeah, I mean the UN has found that the evidence that Hamas, so-called uses human shield is actually rather scant. Nobody would dispute that Hamas operates in civilian areas. There's no place in Gaza that's not a civilian area. Uh, the allegations of hiding missiles in schools and hospitals. There are some instances in which that has borne out, but the various claims that you hear that Hamas has pressured families to stay in their houses, I think that there's actually very little evidence for that, and and there is much greater evidence that Israel is targeting individual members of Hamas, and as they do so, willing to kill upwards of 20 to 25 civilians in so doing. And so I think that that's the important part when we talk about who's willing to risk civilian casualties. If Israel is saying that they're going to target, for instance, the Gaza chief of police, who is a civilian, and kill 18 members of his family, or if they're going to target a member of Hamas's armed wing, as they did earlier this week in an attack that killed 25 members of his family, I think that those are attacks that it's difficult to imagine that response is proportionate, which is one of the elements of abiding by the laws of war. Any strike has to be proportionate. It doesn't mean that you can't kill any civilians and follow the laws of war, but it means that if you are going to kill civilians, it has to be proportionate. And I think that arguing one targeted member of Hamas for 25 civilians, including numerous children, is not proportionate in the slightest.
We're going to have to take a break. I want to come back to this idea of what's proportionate in war. We'll be back after a brief excerpt by Flagland.
What should do? You gotta make it you. The symbols from the
And we're back with our discussion on the violence in Gaza right now. Earlier, John, you were mentioning, proportionate responses in war. And I'm wondering, because this all really started from murders of teenagers, on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. And this current situation of violence does seem completely disproportionate to that initial trigger. Do you think this speaks to the immense volatility of the region, and perhaps, even if it's right now seems to be hindering the peace process, it might in the long run at least draw attention to the urgency of a sustainable solution?
Well, there's no question that there is incredible volatility in the region, and I also unfortunately think there is no real question that there is no immediate solution. In terms of the murdered Israeli teenagers and then the murdered Palestinian teenager in response to that, this round of violence really started earlier than that, when Israel took steps to make sure that the Palestinian Unity government that had formed in June between Fatah and Hamas was not going to be an effective form of government. And so Israeli politicians didn't want a strong Palestinian government. They worked to undermine it. And when the three Israeli teenagers were murdered, it served as a spark that set this, that alighted a situation that was already ready to blow up. I have no idea what the end game either for Hamas or for Israel is, but it seems increasingly clear that you don't hear people talking about a two-state solution anymore, and what the significance of that is, I think, is hard to tell, because it's certainly not as though Israel is going to all of a sudden say, Palestinians, you're full citizens of Israel, and this is your country too, and let's all get along. That's obviously not going to happen. But it seems equally clear that there is no room for a Palestinian state next to Israel anymore, and that, I think, is a real problem, and it's a real weakening of the situation. It's a deterioration from what we saw even in the 90s, when there were at least overtures towards some sort of peaceful status quo.
We're going to have to wrap up soon, but I just want to finish with this question for you. How much do you think this is distracting from other important developments in the region? Because certainly, understandably, all the focus is on this crisis right now, which does make sense on one level. On the other hand, we still have another crisis with ISIS. A lot of other places are still very unstable. Syria is far from resolved. Do you think it's a dangerous distraction, or do you think it's a necessary focus right now in the media?
I think that it's necessary, and I think that it's inevitable. And as much as there has been really terrible media coverage of this crisis, the sort of usual false equivocating that's always a part of U.S. media coverage of Israel and Palestine, the coverage has actually been better than it's been in the past, and I think a lot of that is because you have the emergence of social media. You have many more images of Gazans suffering, and to the extent that that ISIS is a threat, and that the continuing civil war in Syria is a terrible humanitarian crisis, those things are true, but the acute suffering of Gazans right now, I think, is correctly the focus of virtually the entire world. And I think that the more there is focus on suffering in Gaza, that's the only way that there is going to be any sort of reason for optimism years in the future.
Well, that is all the time we have for now. Thank you very much, John, for joining me today. Hopefully, we'll see the situation play out towards more peace, but it certainly looks tragically messy right now. Thank you, John. Share your thoughts with us on Twitter at Breakthrough Radio. We'll be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from a special episode of Live Studio featuring Beverly.
Maybe this time you know to hold on to yourself.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein and this is Breakthrough News, your window into today. Be sure to check out breakthroughradio.com through the weekend for our continued Icon Week coverage, including the story of a Philadelphia mural commissioned to be photographed as album cover art for indie rock songwriter Kurt Weill, but has since become a mecca for graffiti artists and so-called nuisance for the surrounding neighborhood. That's it for what's breaking through the news today. Tell us what's breaking through your world on Twitter at Breakthrough Radio. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein and thank you for joining us.